Hey everyone, Eric Watson here, freelance writer, player of games, writer of words, recorder of videos, and tabletop role-playing aficionado. Welcome to another DM's Guild review, my written and video review series where I take a look at the adventures and supplemental material at the Dungeon Masters Guild website. With this video, I'll be reviewing the DM's Guild adventure, The Executioner's Daughter, designed by Ashley Warren for Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. A review copy has been provided for the purposes of this review. If you enjoy my videos, please consider supporting me via patreon.com/roguewatson. So, my experiences with solo adventures are pretty limited. I have none. I have heard of solo adventures. I recognize that fills a niche for... it is a DM just running an adventure literally for one person, which creates kind of an interesting scenario. Obviously, D&D, I think, and tabletop role-playing in general, is for groups of people coming together and having a good time, but there's really nothing that says you can't have just the one-on-one like that. So I don't have a big basis of comparison, but The Executioner's Daughter is extremely story-heavy. It is very, very story-focused, to where later on at the bottom there's an author's note where the author explains that it's really more of an interactive fiction that the player happens to be involved in, and that is absolutely correct assessment. It's not even written like a standard adventure tabletop module. It is written like a choose your own adventure book, where it's like the DM is essentially reading paragraphs and almost chapters of things happening, and then at the end the player essentially can make a skill check or make a choice, and then it flips to the page, which normally I would balk at this, but I think for a solo adventure that works pretty well. Not for everybody, certainly. So if you're, if your player is, and as the DM, if you're more into just the hacking and the slashing and just killing stuff or going through a dungeon, then obviously this is not going to appeal to you at all. But if you're in it for crafting a story together, a meaningful story, then I think there is a lot to be had here, and I think it's very satisfying in that way. So the adventure takes place in Soldier, which I'm not super familiar with Forgotten Realms lore outside of the Sword Coast. I don't know if that's a real city or if it's just something that the author came up with, but it is just a typical, beautiful, shining city that is ruled by a monarchy, and they have a religious devotion to Bahamut, which is the I guess the good god of dragon. What is it? The chromatic dragons are the good ones, the copper, bronze, gold, that kind of thing. There's the good dragon is Bahamut, and then the evil dragon is Tiamat, and she's got the blue, black, and green dragons, all those. So, dragon lore. And for some reason, even though Bahamut's and it makes note of this, that Bahamut is the god of good dragons, the people have to do the classic fantasy trope of sacrificing a young woman in order to stave off this ancient evil or this curse or this, I think they're supposed to be like attacked by dragons or something. They literally just sacrifice a young woman, literally Hunger Games style, where they like draw things out of a fishbowl, draw the name, and that person has to go, and they never come back. Nobody's sure what actually happens to them, and then that protects the village, the city in this case, for another year. So the twist here, and again, it's all written, and it's hard to cover this because it's literally just written as like, look at this, it's just pages and pages. Even the successful skill checks are like several, like there's a paragraph of information, which I do like, that you are given information or at least some descriptive text, even if you fail the skill check. That's definitely a positive here. But it is, written like literally a novel or novella. Like it is straight up just paragraphs and paragraphs that the DM is reading. And again, that's either going to appeal to you a lot. You're sitting there like getting immersed in this story, and then occasionally, you're interacting with your own choices and skill checks, or this is going to immediately turn you off. So I can see what's going to be very divisive for a lot of people, and just know what you're getting into, which is, hey, it's a good thing you're watching this review. I think it's very well written, though, in terms of the actual story. It is, not only is it well written from, I could see it being fun for a DM to engage a player, but it's just well written to read just from a story standpoint. Like most modules, they're interesting to read and kind of get a feel for like, how would I do this, but a lot of modules I read like, okay, here's all the things I would have to add story-wise or background-wise in order to make this work how I want it to work. And this one is like, I'm not adding a damn thing. Like, this is good to go as written, which is pretty rare because it's so heavily focused on the story that you almost don't need any outside lore information, although there is some there, mostly in those skill checks where you can get that extra bit of information. But it is already all there for you to go, and the player is just basically sitting there, hopefully in rapt attention as you're speaking all this very eloquent, lovely descriptive text. The characters, so the main character is the titular daughter is Domenica, which is a badass name. And she literally has to do the like I volunteer as tribute thing because they pull the names of the hat, the women that can be sacrificed, and they pull the princess, the beloved princess of the city. Oh, gasp! Everyone's freaking out. The princess is crying. The queen's like, do something, and then the woman Domenica just volunteers as tribute, which kind of solves all of their problems. But it's the executioner's daughter. Executioner is the one that's supposed to actually bring the sacrifice to like an altar up on this like mountain nearby. So he freaks out and he won't do it, and that's where the player character has to come step in and offer to escort her essentially. But, and this isn't important, this is kind of the first big choose your adventure thing, as you can see here. Do you respond to High Priest Naham's question? So you can either yes, take her to the sacrifice at Gara's Peak, or you can decline, basically, or you can ask for a price, which actually it turns out that seems to be the best option because you can get, what is it, up to like 500 gold or something without even a skill check. But then if you want a magical item or something of value that exceeds 500 gold, then you roll a persuasion check. If you roll a 17 or higher, it'll straight up give you like a magic item of rare or lower. That's pretty goddamn great for level 3. I should have mentioned this is designed for level 3 solo players, which I don't know how you balance a solo adventure. It seems very difficult, but level 3 is probably a good start because at that point players are at least somewhat, have better strength and power than a wet paper bag, and they can hopefully get things done at least on their own. But I would imagine some classes would have a much better time of this than others, so it would be interesting. But so the main choice is you can decide to either essentially accept the adventure or not. And I've mentioned this in previous modules. It's funny how a lot of designers and writers feel the need to include a contingency plan if the player like essentially declines the adventure. And to me, that's never necessary. I mean, some of them are nice to have, but like there's kind of a contract there between DM and players. And it's like if I give you a story hook and you decline, then okay, we're just not doing that story hook, and hopefully ahead of time if you're preparing the story that your players would accept it. So unless it is a really like a moral question of like would you help this person or not, and then you have a contingency plan of okay, would I help or not. But this one it really feels like, do you accept the adventure to take the woman to the mountain or do you just not? Now in this case, interestingly enough, that changes the story. Like it actually, if you decline to help her, the end result still happens, the twist happens, but then it's just the battle takes place at a different location, and it ends up being a completely different scenario, which is a dragon attacks the city, and then you can choose either fight the dragon or even like flee and run away from the dragon and just let the guards take care of it, which means you could effectively complete this adventure without ever fighting. And that is not something you usually see even in a one-shot. That's very, very rare you see that combat can be entirely avoided, which I enjoy combat. I'm obviously playing RPGs forever, and combat's usually a big part of it. But I do love games, reminds me like the old school Fallout games, where if you had the right set of skills, you could effectively avoid combat, and that was a legitimate way to play the game. So I enjoy that that's here as an option, and I think it's fascinating that the story actually doesn't end if you decline. It just changes in a different way. I would imagine most players would accept the hook because that's literally, it's like you giving the hook for the story. It's like, are you going to accept this mission to help this person of the story that I've got for you? And if the player just says no, like what's their thought process? Like I'm not, now maybe they're like, okay, well I'll say no and then I'll follow them or something. They can work out something else so they do complete it. But it just feels weird that like you would decline it and then you would say, okay, well then this does happen. It's nice to have. I don't know if it's super necessary, but I actually did enjoy that it creates a completely different story. It does make the adventure seem longer than it is because it is like 20-some pages, but it's one of those choose your adventures where you won't even see several pages worth of scenarios happening depending on the choice that you make. So in this case, the whole attack on the city doesn't happen if you escort her to Gara's Peak, which I believe we have to skip. Okay, first is the anointing where it's just, again, it's just all flavorful. Like, this is all just her being prepared for the sacrifice, and there's just, it's like a whole chapter of stuff happening. So yeah, it's this trial by fire, and then the next couple pages you actually skip, but it's the dragon attacking the city, and you have to either fight the dragon or you run away and hide from it. And there's some allies that can assist you. Assuming you go with her, however, we go. It even has the classic choose an adventure thing where it has the end, just after certain things that happen, which is interesting. Assuming you do accept, then you do end up with a random combat fight, which is just a bunch of Bloodhawks, which I think is a standard enemy in the monster manual, though the stat block is repeated here, which is nice to have. But I do source monster manual, which should be, again, pretty easy. Really easy for level 3, but remember, this is a solo adventure. You have one level 3 person, and then you have your ally, Domenica, who does have her own stat block, and she just looks like a level, 1, I was going to say cleric, but her spellcasting is charisma, so I'm probably a sorcerer at that point. Although she has cure wounds. I don't know what the hell class you are. Bard, I guess, maybe. Bard has high charisma and then cure wounds. And she gets her daddy's sword, the executioner's sword, which seems like a magic item, but unfortunately doesn't actually have any kind of magical stat block. And I think that was an oversight, because I read a comment on the DM's Guild page, and it says that the author is preparing an anthology of different volumes, and as an update to this adventure, we'll be adding a official magic item. I don't know if you call it stat block, but where it says the description of what this item is, and that sword is getting one of those. So unfortunately, it's not in the version I have, which is a standalone, but eventually it will have that in there in the anthology. So you get this random fight, which is fine, which makes sense to have it there, because it's important for the Daughters of Saldra, which is what the sacrifices are called, to be escorted. There's a reason for that, because it's not safe to get up this mountain, so it makes sense that there would be a battle there. And then the twist at the end is that the sacrifices are not killed by any kind of monster or dragon, as the people think. Instead, they themselves are transformed into dragons. In Domenica's case, she transforms into this big Obsidian Dragon, and it's a big shock. It's almost written like Animorph style, where it seems very painful, and bones crunching and wings sprouting out. It's all very monstrous and cool. That's a really neat twist, because you think, oh shit, we're being attacked. It's like, oh no, my ally suddenly transformed into the boss. I really like that as a surprise twist. This is a badass picture too, right here. Even though pretty sure that dragon is not nearly that big in the story. And it's an interesting fight. Let's see, where are we at? It has its own stat block. I'm trying to find it. There we go. The new Obsidian Dragon. And it is a CR1 dragon, which again, CR1 seems easy, but this is a solo adventure. It's, there's one level 3 person, and all of I believe the challenge ratings and things are designed for a party of about 4 adventures in a party. So it fucks up the challenge rating system in D&D to only have a solo player. So glancing at this, I have no idea if a solo player will be able to handle this. For a dragon, it's got generally low-ish AC and very low hit points, so that seems good. However, it has very good saving throws. You can see it's got +2, +3, +2, +3 everywhere. The stats aren't great, but good enough, I think. And D&D is so swingy. It's just one hit can be brutal. It doesn't have multi-attack, which is good. However, it does have a fire breath of a 4d6 fire damage, which is brutal, but a low dex saving throw. So I don't know. I'm throwing my hands up on this one. I have no idea how balanced that feels. I'm gonna assume it is fairly balanced. If you didn't escort her, then this dragon just attacks the city, and you don't know what the fuck's going on. You think, oh no, she failed or did something, and it's a surprise in the aftermath when you defeat the dragon that she transforms. Literally, it's a very much a Beauty and the Beast scene, like at the end of Beauty and the Beast, when the Beast rises up and then light shines and and she just transforms back into Domenica, and then she has a big speech about. I'm a little confused about the ending story. Apparently Bahamut visited her as a child and told her she had to, essentially she was destined for this fate and to kind of free the people from this just backwards ass way of protecting their city, and she protects all the other dragons. Which, the weird thing is, you find out that all the previous sacrifices are still alive, and they've all been transformed into dragons, and they're just chilling in this valley nearby. And that creates a big plot hook for me, because like, why the fuck wouldn't all those dragons, like every single sacrifice, attack that city? Like, I would wreak a horrible vengeance on the people. I mean, I guess maybe they're just very kind about like, oh well, we want to not destroy the city, but I don't know. You gotta imagine at least some of them would be like, fuck off. Like, I'm just gonna get my vengeance on. And that's exactly what Dominica does. She transforms into the dragon and goes and fights the city. I just am confused about why there's all these little dragons just kind of chilling out nearby. They're like, no, we're good. We'll let the people pretend like this sacrifice keeps working and keep on letting women get transformed into dragons for a life of weird dragon seclusion. That seems kind of odd, but it looks like it's a cool boss battle. It's a very cool twist at the end. There's an option to lure a hippogriff to help you in case things get really dicey, which is nice. There is a contingency plan if the player actually fails and gets killed by the dragon, in which case it's still kind of a happy ending because she is still freed at the end, and she restores you to life as part of like, oh, you did keep, you tried. it's the Bart Simpson, like, at least you tried, cake. It ends up being a happy ending anyway, which is probably good because again, you can't, as a solo adventure, if the player goes down, there's nobody there to revive you, so it's a bit dicey, especially if you're up on this fucking peak with a dragon. So I like that contingency plan is there, and it's all written very very nicely. But hopefully you can defeat the dragon, in which case then she does the beating the beast thing, and she transforms back into Dominica and hands you the really badass executioner's obsidian blade with like this dragon pommel, and it seems really nice. And then there's no magical like information for it at all, which does seem like a huge oversight, which again, as I mentioned, it is going to appear in the anthology because that seems like a cool item. In her stat block, scroll up, I believe it's mentioned, it is put here, and it says it's a versatile weapon, a longsword, okay, blah blah, once per day imbued with a calming aura that transfers to the target on the moment of its death, which is kind of flavorful for an executioner's sword. So it seems like it would literally have some magical properties there, but nothing else is actually mentioned. So, but I think it will be there in the anthology. So overall, I think it's a cool adventure. It's very niche. You know, a solo adventure is already a very niche thing to have because it's just for one person and it's kind of balanced that way. You could almost scale this for more. It's just that it's one person that ends up helping them escort, but I really don't see why you couldn't have, you know, a group or just a pair of people escort them, because it's not like it's one person's the chosen one or anything. The chosen one is actually an NPC. Your player is just kind of along for the ride, which I'm not sure I would put that as a complaint necessarily, but it's just something you need to know going forward, is that in almost every module, the players are the heroes. The players are the stars. In this one, your player is actually kind of a supporting cast member. You are still making decisions that determines how the story is shaped and how it flows, but ultimately the story is about Dominica, is about the executioner's daughter, and it's you deciding on like kind of her fate, although on the other hand her fate also is kind of the same either way. It always seems to end with her transforming back into Dominica and then telling the people like the sacrifice thing is fucking dumb and she's going to end it. And that kind of happens, you know, in either case she transforms into the dragon. In either case, whether you defeat her or not, she transforms back into Dominica and gives that final statement. So you can change things along the way, but you can't really change the ending that much. So that's how the adventure is fairly linear in that case. But there are nice choices along the way, I suppose. So it's niche, and the fact that it's very story heavy is very niche also. It creates an even narrower nicheness of like, okay, who's looking for a solo adventure, and then within that solo adventure category, who's then looking for something extremely story heavy. Now, normally if something's extremely story heavy, I probably wouldn't get into it too much because that's just how my players are. You know, occasionally they like cool story stuff, but it really needs to have, you know, action involved in there, and you know, maybe there could be like a cutscene or something. But having this whole scenario, several scenes happen of just DM talking, I think my players would get kind of bored, even if it was very engaging, like I think this is. But if you're looking for that, and if that's something you know that your player enjoys, and I say player because it's solo adventure, then I think this is a really good adventure. You just have to know that it is going to be in a very specific niche. So let's go over my pros and cons for the Executioner's Daughter. As we scroll back up to here, I don't know why the cover is so tiny up here, so I'm going to come down to this one right here. So Pro, it's a well-written and fun read, even if you never run the adventure, which is not something I say very often on something on the DM's Guild, but if you actually never end up running this adventure, I think it's still just an entertaining short story to read. It's just, the way it's written is literally just almost just chapters, and occasionally has different things happening, but it's just kind of a short story, and I think it's just entertaining just to read it as a very emotional, evocative story, fantasy story that takes place with a very classic fantasy trope with a nice little twist at the end. I like the way it's organized. I like as a pro, it's organized exactly like a choose an adventure novel, where you have if the players do this, then do this, if they do this, then do this, and you turn to different pages and sections depending on what you do, and there's even an entire, like there's a big split between if you want to help Domenica or not, and there's several pages of events happening in descriptive text that you would never read if you didn't even do that section. So that's a bold choice to put a lot of information in in your story, knowing that a lot of players will never even see this content because it's an either or scenario. So that's something I like seeing. Pro, despite the linearity, the PC is given several good options and outcomes to help shape the story. As I said, the final outcome is largely the same. It's a little changed, a little bit flavorful. I do believe if you help her and defeat her, you are rewarded with the sword. Whereas if you don't help her, or if you don't defeat her, then you do not get the sword at the end. So that's a nice bit of change. It's a way to not punish the hero for failing, but instead, the positive reinforcement. You help, you reward them extra for succeeding, which that is a really nice way to handle a linear adventure. Cons, as I mentioned several times, the lack of the magical stat buff, the Executioner's Sword. I love that sword. I love the idea that it's a memorable item that throughout a player's career. One thing I really liked as a tangent, like playing old Neverwinter Nights modules, is I would acquire, and again, this is 5th edition is not so much about magic items, but 3rd edition very much was, and 3.5. And you would acquire this just huge inventory of magical items, and each one would tell, I would be remembered about that module I played that rewarded me with these unique items. And that's something I really like seeing is a story that rewards you with a specific item that reminds you of that story. It's like a symbol of you completing that adventure. It's not just a random, like, okay, you got this from the DM's Guild because I think it's cool. It's like, no, this is the Executioner's Sword that, with the dragon pommel and the black blade, and it's specifically will remind you always of this adventure. That's really cool, and the fact that it doesn't have an actual magical information on there is a huge oversight. Now, I'm glad it's being rectified, but for now, with the version I have, it is a con. The other con will always be a con for me in that there is no maps. As you can see, scrolling through that adventure, there was not a single battle map. Now, I will say, out of all the adventures I have ever looked at, this one is the least what am I trying to say? It really doesn't need maps, which is weird because I play in Roll20, so I use maps for everything, but it's such a story-driven thing that you could almost just use artwork and not even have to worry about maps. And as I said, you could complete the adventure feasibly without even ever going to combat. If you decline helping Domenica and you run away from the dragon, you would never be in combat. I would imagine most players would at least fight the dragon at the end, in which case you could literally throw up any kind of, I guess, just battle map, because it's just the dragon. There's not a lot of things happening, although in the city, there's obviously things happening, but you would constrain that to like, okay, here's this one little section where the dragon's fighting you, and you would just have everything happen in the background. So I feel like maps are not as necessary in this one. There's no dungeon, there's nothing like that. There's that one Bloodhawk fight. You could use just anything for that. So it's not horrible. I like seeing maps in adventures, no matter the adventure, so that is a con for me. But I will say that having no maps here is not as horrible as a lot of other adventures that have lacked maps or had really shitty maps. So this one doesn't necessarily get a pass for not having maps, but it's not as bad here. So final verdict. Focusing almost exclusively on story, The Executioner's Daughter provides a short but satisfying solo adventure and also doubles as a nice short story. So thank you for everyone to watching this video review. You can see my written review at roguewatson.com. You can support my work at patreon.com/roguewatson, and you can follow our own D&D adventures here on my YouTube channel. Thank you.